The morning light crept softly through the curtains, casting a golden hue on the room where Prince Danso and Wamba lay, unaware of the world stirring beyond their intimate bubble. But the stillness shattered as the door to Danso's private dorm swung open, revealing Namazzi standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. The sight before her, Danso and Wamba, tangled in each other's arms, froze her in place. For a heartbeat, none of them moved. Namazzi's lips parted, as if trying to form words, but no sound came. Danso's heart lurched into his throat, panic flooding his veins. His entire world was teetering on the edge of collapse. All the years of hiding, of fearing his father's wrath, now lay bare before Namazzi's stunned gaze. He didn't know what to say, how to explain. His only instinct was fear, raw, unrelenting fear of what would come next. Wamba's heart raced too, but not for himself. He knew what this could mean for Danso, what kind of danger his love was in. Wamba would have faced the world for him, but he understood the chains that still bound Danso. He stood by Danso's side, silent but protective, his heart aching for the boy he loved. Namazzi remained frozen, as if her mind was struggling to comprehend what she had walked into. Then, without warning, a giggle escaped her, shattering the tension that had wound tight in the room. Danso blinked, confusion knitting his brow. Wamba glanced at Namazzi, equally baffled. Namazzi burst into laughter, her voice filling the room, her body shaking with amusement. Danso stared at her, his panic morphing into bewilderment. "What? Why are you laughing?" he managed, his voice hoarse. Through her laughter, Namazzi wiped a tear from her eye and said, "I'm sorry, you two. It's just, you should have seen your faces. You both looked like you just met death." Wamba and Danso exchanged a look, unsure of what to say. Namazzi, finally gathering herself, let out a long sigh and stepped forward. "So," she said, her tone suddenly calm, "are you two together?" Wamba opened his mouth, ready to step forward and claim what he felt for Danso, but the flicker of hesitation in Danso's eyes stopped him. He loved Danso, but he also knew the weight Danso carried, the fear of his father, the uncertainty. Wamba decided in that moment to stand back, willing to wait for Danso's lead. But Danso, to Wamba's surprise, reached for his hand. "Yes," he said softly, his voice trembling. "We're together." His grip on Wamba's hand tightened, protectively, possessively. The fear of losing Wamba was stronger than the fear of what would come. He couldn't bear to hide anymore. Danso's heart raced as he looked at Namazzi, wondering if this would be the end, if she would betray them, if she would tell his father. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking, "don't tell my father. I'm sorry, Namazzi. I'm sorry for everything, for being with Wamba when I'm betrothed to you, but please, don't tell him." Namazzi's gaze softened, her playful expression giving way to something more gentle. "Relax," she said, shaking her head. "I don't care that you're together. In fact, I'm happy for you." She smiled as if the gravity of the situation didn't exist. "Honestly, I've suspected something was going on, but I wasn't sure." She moved closer, pulling up a chair and sitting in front of the two boys. Her casual demeanor was startling, as if she were discussing nothing more than the weather. "So, who's the top and who's the bottom?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Can you kiss for me? I've always wanted to see two princes fall in love. It's so tragic, isn't it? A forbidden romance in a world that doesn't understand." Danso and Wamba exchanged a bewildered look, completely lost in the surreal turn of events. "What's wrong with you?" Danso asked, still confused. "Aren't you supposed to be angry? I mean, you just caught your betrothed in bed with another man." Namazzi rolled her eyes. "Oh, get over yourself, Danso. I never wanted to marry you anyway, but I would have if I had to." Danso, his ego bruised, winced. Namazzi continued, "This actually works out perfectly. You're with Wamba, which your father will never accept. And I'm with someone else too, but I'm not telling you who. I've been so worried about you finding out. Now we can just keep up appearances and be with whoever we want in secret. It's the perfect arrangement, don't you think?" Danso glanced at Wamba, still processing what Namazzi was proposing. It made sense. It was practical. He nodded slowly, and they struck the deal, a facade to keep the peace while pursuing their real loves in the shadows. As Namazzi stood to leave, she turned back, smirking. "Oh, and by the way, you two might want to lock the door next time. Carrying on an affair that dangerous, and you can't even be bothered to secure some privacy? Amateurs." She rolled her eyes dramatically and walked out, leaving Danso and Wamba standing there, still holding hands, the weight of what just happened settling in. Wamba sat in class, staring blankly at the slate board in front of him. The teacher's voice droned on, but his words barely registered. Wamba's mind was far from the lesson, lost in thoughts of Danso. The corners of his mouth tugged into a small smile, a secret happiness he couldn't contain. It had been 2 weeks since they had become official, 2 weeks of stolen moments, whispers in the dark, and a fire that blazed between them every time they were together. His heart raced at the thought of Danso's smile, the way it softened his face, lighting up his usually hardened features. That smile, Wamba thought, could stop the world. It made Danso even more beautiful, showing a side of him that only Wamba was privileged to see. In the quiet moments when Danso was asleep, Wamba would trace the lines of his face, memorizing every detail. Every time he did, he marveled at the boy lying next to him, the boy he had fought so hard to reach and now had all to himself. The bell rang, shaking Wamba from his daydream. His heart leapt. Finally, he could see Danso again. He was the first out of the class, practically running as if the very wind was chasing him. His feet carried him straight to the library, where he knew Danso would be. Wamba spotted Danso sitting at a table, his head bent over a book. He smiled to himself, the excitement buzzing in his chest as he gestured for Danso to follow. Danso, ever so obedient to Wamba's unspoken commands, looked up, saw him, and quietly stood. He followed Wamba, slipping behind one of the tall shelves where no one could see them. Before Danso could say a word, Wamba grabbed him by the collar and pulled him into a hidden corner. Their lips met in a rush, a kiss full of the longing that had built up all morning. Wamba kissed Danso like a man starved, hands tangled in his collar, pulling him impossibly close. Danso melted into the kiss, his hands finding their place on Wamba's waist. They pulled apart, panting as the sound of approaching students made them freeze. But Wamba didn't step back. His lips still hovered close to Danso's, his breath warm against Danso's skin. His eyes burned with that familiar desire. "Go to your room," Wamba whispered, his voice low, commanding. "I'll meet you there in 5 minutes." Danso's eyebrows shot up in surprise, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. "You're becoming more and more bossy," he murmured, still catching his breath. "Like that boy who punched me months ago. I've been wondering where he went." Wamba smirked, his lips brushing Danso's as he spoke. "I didn't go anywhere. I've just been lost chasing the boy I like. Now that I've caught him, I'll make him pay for making me chase him so hard." He leaned in closer, his voice barely a breath. "Your room, now." Danso's heart skipped a beat at the intensity in Wamba's voice. A thrill ran through him as Wamba gave him one last kiss, a hard kiss that left Danso's lips tingling. He gasped softly when Wamba bit his lower lip, a mix of shock and pleasure flashing through him. Wamba pulled back with a satisfied smirk, turning on his heel and walking away. Danso stood there, watching Wamba disappear around the corner, his heart racing. A stupid, happy smile spread across his face. He packed up his books hurriedly and made his way back to his private room, excitement coursing through him like fire. In the 2 weeks they had been together, everything felt electric. He couldn't stop thinking about Wamba, couldn't stop wanting to be near him, to kiss him, to touch him. They hadn't done more than kiss and hold each other, but even that felt like a kind of bliss Danso had never known. As he hurried down the hall, he thought about how Wamba's kisses had become the center of his world. The way Wamba moaned softly when they kissed, the way he smelled, the way his hands traced the lines of Danso's body, it was intoxicating. Danso had fallen hard, and he knew it. He hadn't felt this alive since his mother had passed, since he had lost the one person who made him feel like he belonged. His thoughts drifted to her, his mother. He had been 10 when she died, and he could still remember the softness in her voice, the gentle way she had always looked at him. They had been close, too close for his father's liking. His father had insisted that Danso spend more time with him, away from his mother's influence. A boy should not grow up with so much softness around him, King Kofi had said. It will make him weak. His father's words echoed in his mind, but they no longer held the power they once did. In Wamba's arms, Danso felt free. Free to be soft, free to be himself. When Danso reached his dorm room, his mood shifted abruptly. His maid, one of the 3 women who had traveled with him all his life, was there, standing over something shattered on the floor. The pieces of a precious vase his mother had made for him were scattered across the room. "Idiot!" Danso shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The maid, an older woman, trembled as she knelt, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the broken pieces. "I'm so sorry, Your Highness," she whimpered, her voice breaking. "It was an accident. Please, forgive me." Danso's fury boiled over. "Forgive you? You're useless." He took a step toward her, his hand raised as if to strike her. The maid cowered, tears welling in her eyes. But before he could do anything, Wamba rushed into the room, grabbing Danso's arm. "Stop!" Wamba's voice was firm, unyielding. "What are you doing?" Danso froze, the anger still coursing through him, but Wamba's presence grounded him. He lowered his arm, though his face still burned with fury. "Get out!" he spat at the maid. "Leave!" The woman scrambled to her feet, bowing as she hurried out of the room. Once she was gone, Wamba turned to Danso, his expression stern. "You can't treat people like that, Danso. You have to apologize." Danso scoffed, incredulous. "Apologize? To a maid? I'm a prince, Wamba. I don't apologize to anyone, let alone a servant." Wamba's face darkened, the anger clear in his eyes. "You have to apologize. That's no way to speak to your elders." Danso stared at him, bewildered. "Why do you care? She's just a maid." "No one is just a maid," Wamba said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "She's someone's mother, someone's friend, someone's wife. How would you feel if someone spoke to your mother like that?" Danso's chest tightened at the mention of his mother. "She's a peasant," he muttered, defensively. Wamba looked him dead in the eye. "So am I, or have you forgotten where I come from?" Danso's heart sank at the weight of Wamba's words. He stood there, silent, as Wamba's anger simmered between them. "If you don't respect her, you don't respect me," Wamba continued. "Apologize to her." Danso blinked, taken aback. "Why is this so important to you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Because my mother was a maid too," Wamba said softly. "And she had an employer just like you. I can't be with someone who doesn't respect people like me." Danso's heart clenched at the thought of losing Wamba. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice strained. "Are you breaking up with me?" "I'm not breaking up with you," Wamba replied, his voice firm. "But if you want this relationship to work, you need to apologize." "I can't," Danso whispered. "What will people think? My reputation?" Wamba simply nodded. "Okay." Without another word, he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Danso stood there, frustration and fear swirling in his chest. He couldn't apologize to a maid. It was unheard of. But Wamba's words lingered, especially the mention of his mother. He clenched his fists, unsure of what to do, hoping Wamba would come back to him soon. That night, Danso lay awake, his thoughts spinning. Wamba's words haunted him. He hated the idea of apologizing, but he hated the idea of losing Wamba even more. The next day, Danso waited in the library, his heart anxious with each passing moment. Wamba was always the one who came looking for him, excited and smiling, dragging him away from their studies for secret kisses and stolen moments. But today, Wamba hadn't shown up. Every day for the past 2 weeks, they had met during breaks, kissed and held each other whenever they could. But not today. Time ticked on, and the quiet library seemed louder in its emptiness as Danso waited. After what felt like an eternity, he decided to go find Wamba himself. It was the first time he had ever gone looking for Wamba. It had always been Wamba who chased after him. His heart pounded at the realization, and with each step, a small unease began to settle in the pit of his stomach. He found Wamba sitting in the courtyard with his friends, laughing and talking. Wamba looked carefree and happy, but when Danso caught his eye and gestured for him to come over, Wamba merely glanced at him and returned to his conversation, completely ignoring the silent signal. Danso's chest tightened. He tried to play it cool, but the rejection stung. He couldn't stand the feeling of being shut out. After dinner, Danso decided to wait by Wamba's dorm room. When Wamba appeared in the hallway, he didn't greet him with the usual playful smile. Instead, Wamba's face was serious. "Did you apologize to her?" Wamba asked, his voice steady but with an edge of finality. Danso hesitated, trying to stammer out an explanation, but Wamba wasn't interested in excuses. "Come back when you have," he said, turning his back and closing the door with a firm thud, leaving Danso standing there, confused and stung by the coldness of Wamba's dismissal. The next day, Danso was losing his mind. He had grown so attached to Wamba in such a short time, and now, not having him around felt like a wound he couldn't ignore. Wamba was always in his thoughts, during class, while eating, even in his dreams. He had become something of an obsession. One of his friends had noticed the change, teasing him. "You've been smiling so much lately, it's almost unsettling. Where's the old angry Danso we know and love?" Danso had laughed it off, but now he wondered if he had truly ruined everything by being too proud to apologize. Wamba's words echoed in his head. What if Wamba was right? He had been raised by his father to think that kindness was weakness, something to be avoided. But his mother, she had always been gentle and kind. She had told him to treat everyone with respect, and before she died, Danso had clung to her advice. King Kofi had tried to erase that side of him, but now, in Wamba's absence, his mother's words resurfaced. Would she have wanted him to apologize? Yes, she would have. Walking back from class the next day, Danso saw something that turned his stomach. Across the courtyard, Wamba stood with his friends, laughing, completely at ease. For a moment, Danso felt the familiar warmth, but that changed the instant Wamba's eyes locked with his. Wamba glared at Danso, then moved closer to T, who stood beside him. With deliberate slowness, Wamba slid his arm around T's shoulders, pulling him close in one smooth motion. T, oblivious to the storm brewing in Danso, leaned in eagerly, looking up at Wamba with wide, adoring eyes, clearly smitten. Wamba's gaze, however, wasn't on T. It was locked on Danso, a look of challenge in his eyes, daring him to do something. A knot formed in Danso's stomach. His first instinct was to storm over, grab Wamba, and drag him away. He really hated the idea of anyone else touching Wamba. But that look in Wamba's eyes, the same defiant, stubborn glint that had caught his attention when they first met, stopped him. Wamba wasn't just ignoring him out of spite. This was a challenge. Danso gritted his teeth, turned on his heel, and stormed off to his private quarters, his mind racing. Back in his room, Danso found his maid cleaning up. She looked startled when he approached her. In a voice far softer than he was used to, he asked, "Please come with me." The maid blinked in confusion, clearly shocked at his polite tone, but followed him without question. A few moments later, they stood in the courtyard, where Wamba and his friends were still gathered. The students looked up, curious, as Danso approached. Without hesitation, he turned to his maid and, with a clear and loud voice, apologized. "I'm sorry," Danso said, his voice loud enough for Wamba to hear. "I was wrong to treat you the way I did." The poor maid looked utterly baffled, unsure of how to react. The other students murmured among themselves, stunned to see the arrogant prince apologizing to his maid. His friends exchanged glances, clearly taken aback. What was happening to Prince Danso? After the apology, Danso turned his gaze toward Wamba, his brow raised slightly as if asking, "Are you satisfied now?" Wamba, his arm still around T, removed it immediately, and a small smile flickered across his lips. It was a silent acknowledgement, a signal that things were starting to mend between them. Before Wamba could follow Danso, Namazzi caught his arm, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What have you done to the prince?" she whispered, baffled. "He's turning into a human being. I saw him smelling a rose the other day and smiling. It gave me goosebumps." Wamba didn't respond. His heart raced as he hurried after Danso. He had missed Danso terribly, and now that Danso had apologized, Wamba felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He had always known that there was kindness within Danso's heart, hidden beneath layers of pride and fear. And now that Danso had shown that side of himself, Wamba's affection for him only deepened. Danso waited anxiously for Wamba in the back of the library, his heart pounding with anticipation. He hadn't dared to look back after his apology, unsure if Wamba would follow. His palms were sweating, and the normally confident prince felt a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement building in his chest. His thoughts spiraled. What if Wamba hadn't forgiven him? What if this apology wasn't enough? But then, in the stillness of the library, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of Wamba's footsteps approaching. His heart leaped in his chest. When Wamba reached him, Danso instinctively reached out, his hand moving to pull Wamba close for a kiss. But before his fingers could even brush against Wamba, Wamba blocked his touch, taking control of the moment. Without warning, Wamba grabbed Danso by the collar, his grip firm and commanding. Danso found himself being backed into the wall, forced to retreat until his spine pressed against the cool surface. Wamba's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Danso felt his pulse quicken. There was a different intensity in Wamba's gaze, something domineering, something that scared and excited him all at once. The look alone made Danso shiver, even before Wamba's lips touched his. When Wamba finally leaned in, their lips met in a kiss that felt like fire. The hunger, the need, It was all there, and Wamba kissed Danso with a passion that left him breathless. Danso felt his knees go weak under the intensity of it all, as if the ground itself was shifting beneath him. How had he survived these last few days without Wamba's kisses? It seemed impossible now. The sensation of Wamba's lips on his, the heat between them, the way their bodies moved together. It was everything Danso had missed. He didn't need to think. He just melted into Wamba's kiss, letting himself be carried away by the moment, completely at Wamba's mercy. And in that moment, Danso realized just how much Wamba had him wrapped around his finger. He would do anything Wamba asked, anything to feel this closeness, this intensity. Wamba had become the center of his world. The library was quiet, the soft rustling of pages and the occasional cough, the only sounds filling the air. Jafari moved through the aisles, his thoughts heavy with personal troubles. His relationship with the Dark King had been strained lately, and the weight of it pressed down on him. Still, he tried to distract himself, browsing through the shelves in search of a book that might lift his spirits. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye. Two figures, half hidden in the dim light of a secluded part of the library. He stopped, peering closer. It was Wamba and Danso, their bodies pressed close, lips locked in a kiss filled with urgency and passion. Jafari's heart skipped a beat, not from shock, but from concern. He cleared his throat loudly, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Instantly, the two boys pulled apart, their eyes wide with guilt. Wamba's face flushed red, and Danso's usual confidence faltered as he stared at the ground. "Both of you," Jafari said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Come to my office, now." The two boys exchanged a nervous glance, but did as they were told, their heads bowed as they followed Jafari through the library. The walk to his office felt like an eternity, each step heavy with the feeling of being caught, like children facing a parent after breaking a rule. Neither of them dared to speak, and the weight of what had just happened hung thick between them. When they reached Jafari's office, the door creaked open and the boys stepped inside. Jafari sat behind his desk, his usual warm demeanor replaced with a seriousness they hadn't seen before. He motioned for them to sit. Wamba fidgeted in his chair, unable to meet Jafari's eyes. Danso sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. "So," Jafari began, leaning forward slightly, "are you two together now?" Both boys nodded, almost in unison, still too embarrassed to speak. Jafari's lips twitched into a small smile, the tension in the room easing just a bit. He looked at Wamba and said, "Good for you. You finally got your boy." Wamba's cheeks reddened, a shy smile tugging at his lips as he glanced down at his hands, and then over at Danso. For a moment, the air lightened, a hint of playfulness returning to the room. But then Jafari's expression shifted, growing serious again. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice more measured now. "Are you two having sex?" The question hit the boys like a punch. Wamba's eyes widened in shock, and he practically dissolved into his chair, his hands flying to his face in mortification. Danso shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the floor as if he could find an escape there. "No," they both blurted out at the same time, their voices tinged with embarrassment. Wamba could barely breathe, wishing the earth would swallow him whole. Talking about this with Jafari, someone so close to his dad's, was the last thing he ever wanted. Jafari, sensing their discomfort, softened his tone. "Listen," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sex is nothing to be ashamed of, but as your teacher, and more importantly, as your guardian and a friend of your parents, it's my responsibility to talk to you about this. I have to make sure you know what you're doing if..." And I'm not saying you should, but if you ever decide to take that step. Wamba squirmed in his seat, unable to look up. Danso's face remained tense, though his eyes flickered toward Jafari, trying to gauge where this conversation was headed. As your teacher, I'm telling you, sex isn't something to be rushed into. You need to be mature, and you need to know what you're doing. And as a friend of your parents, Jafari added with a slight smile, I'm telling you to stay innocent for as long as you can. But I'm not delusional. If you two ever decide to do anything, and again, I'm not saying you should, there are things you need to know. He stood and walked over to a bookshelf, pulling down an old worn book. He placed it on the desk before the boys. This, he said, his tone calm but serious, will teach you everything you need to know about safe sex. Read it. Make sure you both understand what it means to be responsible. And take your time. There's no rush. Wamba glanced at the book, his face still burning with embarrassment. Danso, though still uncomfortable, seemed to relax just a little, nodding his understanding. As they stood to leave, Jafari called out to Wamba, his voice gentle. Wamba, I'm sure your dad would want me to tell you to stay innocent forever. His lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. But that's up to you. Just read the book, okay? Wamba nodded quickly, eager to escape the room, and the two boys hurried out, closing the door behind them. As soon as they were gone, Jafari sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. A soft chuckle escaped his lips as he thought about Kwame and Adebayo. Those two? What have they done to me? He muttered to himself, though the fondness in his voice betrayed his affection for Wamba. He had never expected to become a co-parent of sorts, but here he was, worrying over the kid like he was his own. The thought lingered as he glanced at the now empty chairs. Wamba had found someone, and that meant a lot. Jafari just hoped the boy was prepared for everything that came with loving someone, especially in a world that wasn't always kind. The school was alive with excitement as students prepared to return home for the holidays. The air buzzed with laughter and chatter, the halls filled with the echo of feet rushing to pack up belongings. It was a time of joy and reunion, the anticipation of seeing family and friends after long months apart. For Wamba, the excitement was bittersweet. He couldn't wait to return to Nigeria, to be with his sister Arewa and his dads. He had missed them deeply, especially his little sister's playful laughter and the warmth of their home. But something else lingered in his mind, a weight that pulled at him even in the midst of the excitement. Danso. Danso was quieter than usual, his face shadowed by a heaviness that Wamba hadn't seen before. They were sitting together in Danso's room, the sound of students rushing outside just a distant hum. Wamba reached out, taking Danso's hand in his, their fingers intertwining. "What's wrong?" Wamba asked gently. Danso stared at the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not looking forward to going home." Wamba frowned. "But you'll see your dad." Danso's jaw tightened at the mention of King Kofi. "That's exactly the problem," he muttered. "There's no love there, Wamba. No warmth. It's just me, in a palace that feels like a prison. It's not like your home. My father and I, we don't get along. It's lonely, and I dread every minute of it." Wamba's heart ached, hearing the sadness in Danso's voice. He thought of his own life before being adopted by Kwame and King Adebayo. The loneliness, the feeling of not having a family to call his own. He squeezed Danso's hand a little tighter, speaking without hesitation. "Then don't go home. Come with me to Nigeria." Danso blinked in surprise. "What?" "Come home with me," Wamba repeated, a smile pulling at his lips. You don't have to be alone in that big palace. You can stay with us for the holidays. My dads will understand. You're Kwame's cousin. People will just think you're visiting family." Danso hesitated, looking conflicted. "But your dads? And what about my father? He'll find out I'm in Nigeria. He'll be furious." "Don't worry about my dads," Wamba reassured him. "They'll be fine with it. As for your dad, we'll figure it out when the time comes. You deserve a holiday that's full of love and joy, not one spent trapped in that cold place." The thought of escaping the palace and spending the holidays with Wamba and his family tugged at Danso, but the fear of his father's reaction still loomed large. "I don't know, Wamba. What if your family doesn't want me there?" Danso said, uncertainty heavy in his voice. "They'll want you there," Wamba said confidently. "And I do too." Danso's expression softened, but there was still something holding him back. "Kwame," Danso murmured, "I said horrible things to him the last time we spoke. I was scared. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me." Wamba looked at him with gentle understanding. "Kwame loves you. Whatever happened, he'll understand. Just be honest with him when you see him. Trust me, he's been where you are before." There was a long pause as Danso weighed the decision. Finally, after a deep breath, he nodded, a small but genuine smile appearing on his face. "Okay, I'll come with you." Wamba grinned, pulling Danso into a tight embrace. "You won't regret it," he whispered. "I promise." I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for your incredible support. Your likes, shares, comments, and subscriptions really help the channel grow, and I truly appreciate every bit of it. Thanks for being such an amazing community, and I look forward to bringing you even more great content.